All right, y'all, welcome back. This is lesson 4, the history and representation of poetry and how I use it. This is the last lesson. I'm glad y'all have been on board for the first 3. I hope you all enjoyed this one as much as the other 3, and we're going to get right into it. Well, for me, I guess if I can use myself as an example, it started, I was a child, and I remember reading Edgar Allan Poe. So I guess it goes back that far for me. And as I got more into it, I started going back further and further. And Khalil Gibran is one of my favorite poets. Who his life, his interesting story is like a poem in itself. But even after that, as I grew and got older and started to understand spirit and holy scriptures and books, I think if from a writer's perspective, I think those books were written in parable, metaphors. I think those books were poems, the Bible, the Quran, and just other books of some type of spiritual nature. I think those books were also written. And so I guess poetry has been around since word has been around. Because I think if we look at the character of this Jesus figure that they give us, Jesus or whatever you want to call him, he spoke in metaphor and parables. So I think that was him speaking in poem. Basically, he was poetic in his speech and his way of talking to his brethren and to his masses. So I think poetry has been around since the beginning of time. I don't think there was ever a time when we didn't have poetry, basically. Well, I think poetry is a significant form of writing because I think it's vivid. I think it's like mixing writing with other forms of art, painting and drawing. I think you can hear a poem and you can see it. You know what I mean? So I think that's what makes it so significant. I can see the words that the poet is saying. I can see them, and that's what makes it beautiful to me is that I can visualize what the person is saying. So I try to do that with my own. I try to make sure that you can see whether it's painful or pleasure. I want you to be able to see what I'm saying. I want a picture to come up in your head when you hear a word that I use. So I think that's the significance of it. I think it bridges all art forms together, I believe, with just the word. It bridges all art. Well, I think poetry has been adapted to pop culture. You hear it in different forms, whether I agree with those forms or not. You hear it in commercials, when they're selling something to you, they do it in a poetic form. They rhyme it or something of that nature. We've seen poetry on HBO. It has HBO Deaf Poetry Jam. They've taken into many series where they brought poetry into the TV world, to let these poets tell their story. Again, doesn't matter how people feel about it. You got people who agree with certain things and you got people who disagree, but it doesn't matter. The question is, how has it got into pop culture? It's a big part of pop culture now. There are artists who have gained a career basically off the pop cultureness of poetry now because they have brought these poets into the limelight, into the forefront. I've seen poets become actors. So it is definitely a big part of pop culture right now. Again, doesn't matter how we feel about it. That's the reality of it. It's a big part of pop culture. Well, for me, I use poetry as a form of therapy and self-reflection. That is my intro to poetry. I started writing as a healer. Initially, I'm from a place called Gary, Indiana. It was a violent place. It wasn't only violence. I want to make sure that I'm not giving this one side of this place where I'm from, but violence was a part of it. And for me, that was not the most significant part, but it was a part that I dealt with in my day-to-day life. So to escape from that, I would write. I remember initially writing poems for friends of my mother's. When they would lose their children to some type of violence in the street, I would write a poem to kind of make them feel better. So it was my way of helping them, I guess, or at least letting them know what their son meant to other people other than themselves. And I think it evolved from there, and I started turning it into myself because I was affected by those same things that those parents were affected by. So I started using it to heal myself as well. And I don't think that really kicked in until 92, 93 when I moved from Gary to Memphis. And I had to look at my life back in Gary, and I started writing those self-reflecting poems to help myself heal. So I became my own therapist. I was the poet who was healing the human being, basically. So I used it to help myself in the same way I tried to use it to help others. And now I try to use it to help the greater society. So I have evolved from that. I think the best way for somebody who's new to poetry to channel it is to just evaluate themselves and see what it is that they're going through. And the best way to do that is to look at it. You have to have that out-of-body experience. Put it on paper. It doesn't have to be a poem, by the way. Just write what it is that you're going through at that moment. The poem will come, but it starts to write itself. If that person is truly interested in writing a poem or is truly interested in being a poet, you at least have to get it out. It's kind of like when you go to a therapist and they ask you what's going on with you and they writing everything down. You ask yourself, what's going on with me? And you write it down. I think that's the beginning of it for me. You write it down and you look at it. And the same way those writing exercises, you take that one word and you find out how many words you can come up with from that word. You write down those problems and you condense those problems and you create a poem around those problems or those things that you feel like are plaguing you or those things that you want to improve in your own life. So I think there's many different ways that you can get into it, but it has to hit the paper first. Don't put the pressure on yourself to try to make it a poem immediately. Write it down. Whatever it is going on, the poem will come afterwards. Once I left Gary, like I said, I looked back at my life because, you can pack up and move, but when you put your socks and your underwear and your pants and your jackets in the suitcase, you put your problems in there with it. And just because you relocated and went to another place don't mean that the problems didn't come with you. I thought that that's what was happening, but the problems came with me. So I had to analyze my life back in Gary, and I wrote this poem, and I bridged it between my father's Vietnam and me growing up in Gary, Indiana. And the poem is called POW, which I titled Prison of War. And if it's okay with my audience, I'd like to read it. The place where I grew up wasn't too much different than Vietnam. I grew up in GI, that's Gary, Indiana, and it was a war zone. Now, it wasn't a war fought by the Vietnamese. My war was fought by some real BLs and some real GDs. So this makes me a prisoner of war. Where do we go for help? There are no veterans associations for brothers in hood, but yet I suffer from the same symptoms as that of a Vietnam vet. I have flashbacks, war scars, and a strong case of insomnia for always having to be alert and watch my back. Again, I ask, where do we go? I was even forced to go AWOL once after my commanding officer became a casualty. But after a short break away, I was summoned home by my captain. She said that she needed me. So I returned home with hopes that things had finally changed for the better. But unfortunately, I found myself being faced with more casualties, one after the other. So now at this stage of my life, I'm looking back on my blood brother's life and so many other foot soldiers and comrades who became casualties. And I realized we were just like those veterans of Vietnam, fighting enemies that we couldn't see. That was my narration poem to myself, analyzing what I had been through and trying to figure out the problems that were caused by all the death and all the things that I have seen, and knowing that I had to put that out creatively so I can move past that. I wasn't able to move past until I was able to write it out and do self-therapy and get it out and then put it out in poem form so somebody else can say, you know what, I can relate to that. So I actually use it for myself, but it's also been used as a healer for somebody else who might be going through the same thing. So that was an example of how I think a person can take, because I also saw the distance between my father and his children because of what was stolen away from him from seeing so much bloodshed in Vietnam. And I want to bridge those two gaps to kind of help heal myself and understand him better as an adult, because I didn't really quite understand him as a child because he didn't understand what happened to himself as well, because they just got left hanging when they came back from Vietnam. Like, okay, just go back into society, go make a family, and go take care of yourself. Well, after seeing so much bloodshed and so much death, you need some counseling, you need some healing from that. So I was trying to understand both of us, myself and him. And I think that poem kind of helped bridge the gap between father and son. Thank you all for allowing me to read that. So also, if I may, I'm going to talk about some things that I have going on in the community. I am the interim host at Pensacola Poetry, Constant Coffee and Tea. It's the Constant Coffee and Tea right at as Cervantes Inn, Scenic Highway picks up. It's right around that bend on the left-hand side. And we meet every Tuesday at 6 p.m. And it goes from 6 until, and it's open mic. You get 2 poems. If you're there before 7:30, you can sign the list. Get there after 7:30, you can just be a good audience member. So, and that's every Tuesday, and sometimes my co-host is there who's 12 years old. She's also amazing. It's a no censorship venue. It's a free space, so come on in. It's free. And good food, good coffee, good tea. Come on in and every Tuesday, and that's where we're at. It's the open mic. It's the place where we build people who are first-timers into full-time poets. So my phone number, which is the best way to get in contact with me, which is 901-212-6695. Also, I have my last 2 CDs on my Bandcamp website. That's stillblacksea.bandcamp.com. Again, I would love to thank the PMA, the Pensacola Museum of Art, for putting this together, and you all should be just as pleased as I am that these kind of things exist. We need our local art galleries and studios working with local artists to make sure that we can bridge the gap between the artists and the community. And this has given us opportunity to do that. So let me thank PMA for doing this as well. Also, the NEA Big Read Grant, I want to give thanks and shouts out to them as well. And to the listening audience and everybody who's watching, thank y'all for just being interested in arts, because the arts is how we fix these problems that we have going on in our society. So, and my name is Q, and this has been a pleasure for me to be here. So thank you all, and feel free to call me or email me at any given time.